Why shouldn't people have a private life? Why should you so-called bring your whole self to work? Heaven forbid you should bring your whole self to work. Most of us don't want to see you.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. Today I am joined by Baroness Emma Nicholson. We're going to be talking about the creative arts, culture and the culture wars. Emma, thank you so much for joining us on Spectator TV. Now, we've got a lot of things to talk about, but one of the key things I want to ask you about is the creative arts, and we'll take it from there. Lisa Nandy is the Culture Minister, and at the beginning of her new job, she said, the era of the culture wars is over. Now, there's been a year-long row in the Royal Literature Society that I'm sure you've been across. What do you think? Is the era of culture wars over?
The culture war is just boiling up to peak and go down again. And I'm afraid we have to thank Mr. Trump for that, because he's decided to punch the culture war in the stomach and let it collapse completely. And he's already started. It's frustrating to have the USA start to resolve our problem. But I have been very, very shocked indeed by the writing world in the UK recently. The Royal Society's behaviour is really unacceptable. But I'm not surprised, because when I came out in terms of countering the culture war's bizarre belief that men can become women, heaven help them, the people who threw me off their boards immediately were writing boards. The Booker Prize, which my late husband had founded and ran for a very long time, very successfully and creatively. And also the Michael Morpurgo board threw me off as well, of a children's writing. And I was absolutely astonished at the weakness of writers here, authors here. Now, a whole great group of people called the Wild Women's Writing Club came out in favour. But I come from a background where I chaired for 20 years, when my late husband died, the Booker Prize for Russian fiction against Mr. Putin. And we hung on, they wrote, we were open, everything was honest, wonderful creative writing against Mr. Putin. And he only managed to close us down 2 years ago. Those are real writers. Who are these people here?
Let's go back to what happened with the Booker Prize. So it was your late husband that set it up, and it was in 2020 you were embroiled in a row. What happened?
In 2020, I had been reading carefully the background about the transgender world. Why did I bother when it was nothing to do with me? I'm a member of the House of Lords and nothing more. Because some nurses came to see me, young nurses, and they'd been sacked because they didn't agree with telling patients that men could be women. And they said it was against the training, it was against the examinations, and they couldn't do it. What was the outcome? They were sacked. Soon after they came to see me, 2 teachers came to see me. They too had refused to tell their pupils. They were new teachers, recently qualified, lovely young women. They'd lost their entire careers and were not going to be rehired, and the same with the nurses. I was so shocked that young women could lose their jobs like that on the basis of an untruth when they were trying to be accurate scientifically and logically, that I actually looked into it quite hard. And that led me to moving in on understanding a little bit better by dint of getting onto Twitter, now X. And there I was opposed by a ferocious pack of vixens, really. I mean, really enormous, of, I think, mainly gentlemen saying they were women, and somehow I had ruffled their hair in a way. And they were very, very angry and demanded that I should be removed from the Booker. And the Booker at that time was not of the calibre that my late husband had left it, which was really magnificent, highly regarded, and very, very hard work for him as well. And they threw me off their little advisory board, which was odd because the Modern Book had been set up by myself and another person they threw off. They threw 3 people off at once as an excuse to getting rid of me. And we had been the people who had registered the current Booker as a charity after the Booker Prize itself was dropped from the company that ran it.
How were you told?
The Booker Board threw me off by sending me a letter telling me that I was no longer part of it. They had 3 or 4 of us who'd helped set it up before the current group came, and they threw us all off. It was completely crazy because the other 3 were really outstanding people. A very, very senior person in the House of Lords, an enormously famous playwright who was very elderly, and someone else as well. I thought they were very, very badly behaved, apart from anything else, and also rather silly. And they said that I was unacceptable to them. OK, fair enough, I'm unacceptable. But that's no reason for throwing 3 much more important people off as well. It was a very odd piece of behaviour. And it didn't make me look at the Booker Prize for English fiction in the same light as before. I think they've... but really it worried me that writers should want to do this.
Yeah, and it's funny because it's writers that should be the ones that champion free speech.
That is what is happening in Russia. It is the writers who stood out and insisted on writing against Mr. Putin, who only would accept writing. It was exactly what he wanted said. And all the writers who were with me on the Booker Prize for Russian fiction, people I really admire. Do I admire the current Booker Board? No. How can I? I mean, it's their choice. They do what they want. But nonetheless, it's not in the spirit of creative writing and arts, which should be free.
So let's talk about the Royal Literature Society row, because they've fallen out about Salman Rushdie. They've fallen out about censorship, but they've also fallen out about diversity in selecting who should be part of the Royal Literature Society. Is all of this being driven from the authors themselves, or do you think the business model behind the creative industry has become so woke, to use the term, that they're terrified of not reaching certain quotas, appearing to be so left and liberal? Who's driving this?
I'm not a fan of the current diversity movement because it is significantly undiverse. It is one of the most narrow outfit approaches I've ever seen in my life. For example, we were pushed in the House of Lords, forced to go to some training course. Betty Boothroyd refused, as a result of which they threw her out of the House of Lords, the first ever woman speaker of the House of Commons. They had the cheek of saying she couldn't come near the House of Lords. At the time she refused, she was in any way in operation in hospital. So it shows you the narrowness of the thinking. I went, and I found that it was the least diverse and most expensive caboodle that I'd ever met. Because diversity, if you're going to use the word at all, means all and everyone. And I happen to have been born profoundly deaf. My eyesight took a long walk and didn't come back when I was 9. So I could claim to be handicapped if I really felt like it. I don't. It's just boring. I'm me. But I was fascinated that this diversity excludes handicap. So it's only really interested in other people's sexual behaviour. And I think that's just total vulgarity. Why shouldn't people have a private life? Why should you so-called bring your whole self to work? Heaven forbid you should bring your whole self to work. Most of us don't want to see you. But I think, therefore, that the Royal Society has very much gone down the wrong way. I also think it's already out of date because people have woken up at last. And, I mean, Mr. Trump is one thing, I agree, but over here we've also at last woken up and seen that this whole movement is merely a way of making a slightly unattractive group of people make more money than they should otherwise justify, and give themselves titles and statuses that are not really indicators of their excellence. So I don't think I think the Royal Society is very, very out of date in its approach. But worse than that, when this happened to me, a number of other people came to me in despair. They had been forbidden to display their work. They had been forbidden to get contracts. They weren't allowed to act. They weren't allowed to dance. They weren't allowed to make their clay models. They weren't allowed to embroider. In other words, their creativity had been sidelined and crushed by the very people who should be supporting them. So I don't think there's any business model. I think there should be freedom, which is the fundamental reason that we exist in politics, is freedom. Freedom of speech, freedom to worship, freedom to create. And this whole so-called business model is merely a way of crushing freedom.
A lot of artists and authors will talk about the cuts to funding in the creative arts. And I have a very good friend. She's an opera singer. And one of the topics that we talk about a lot is funding cuts. There's no work. And one of the questions I have is perhaps the creative arts have spent too long relying on government funding and has pushed down quality of production, because if you create a business model that's for profit, you will make high quality things because you want to sell tickets. Do you think that there needs to be a total revamp of the business model in the creative industry so that, yes, you slash the funding, it becomes more privatized, and then the production becomes higher quality?
Well, I'm an honorary officer of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Opera, and I and my colleagues have launched a campaign to get singing particularly back into primary schools, because Michael Gove, in his wisdom, in order to uplift British teaching and outturns on what is called STEM, science, technology, engineering, and so on, cut out all the arts. And without music, I believe that may be why so many children are now being referred to the NHS for mental health problems. I say that very seriously. I'm doing a lot of research on it. We have some funding, because that's exactly the way in which we in the Amar Foundation have been restoring the lives and futures of the Yazidi victims of mass destruction and of genocide. So it's extraordinary what singing can do, and music as a whole, choirs. I'd like to get that choral work back into primary schools. As honorary officer of the opera APPG, I mean, there aren't any young singers coming forward because they're not learning in school. Which means that the only young musicians I can find, the ones who are in quartets and who are singing and so on, went through private education. That means it's a very, very narrow band. And it's both a black mark for private education, yet another one, and for singing. But even worse than that, think of all the talent that is not being found and fostered. And think of the mental health of the children who are brought up with no music.
What do you think about religion and how the lack thereof religion plays in this? Because some people might say that politics has become a new religion, and people are so lacking in faith themselves that they have turned to things like gender ideology or the climate agenda, and they believe it so strongly because they're lacking in their own version of spirituality.
Most of the world belongs to a major faith, and the biggest major faith is, of course, Christianity. And just behind it is Islam. Everything else is shriveled into tininess behind those two huge faiths. So people don't go to church very much, but I don't think that means they don't necessarily believe that there's a higher being, which is the word they use in the alcoholic world. To try to stop drinking, remember there's a higher power. It's not just you here. I do think people, if they don't see something like a higher power, which I would call God, they do tend to feel very naked and miserable. And then they start getting vast anxiety complexes and all sorts of things. I don't really think it helps them. We all need to belong. Humans are a collegiate species, and I think we need to belong. And the church is superb at gathering in. What people tend to forget at the moment is that our legislation is based on the second great commandment, love thy neighbour as thyself. So at the end of the day, the British system is there to help. It's not there to own. And that's really what the battle is going on at the moment. Are we going to be able to hold on to that with AI and so on? It's going to take a lot more work than we're giving at the moment. And if we don't, then we will land up with a near-communist way of doing it, when the state is your owner.
Speaking of communism and the state, we've had 7 months of a Labour government. They have a majority. How do you think they're getting on?
Well, the question is, how are the Labour Party getting on in government? And that's a really triple-edged question, because they're having such difficulties with the most extraordinary things. I guess that the other side of the fence is further away than one tends to think. In other words, within minutes they were wrestling with exactly the same problems we saw that we had been wrestling with, that they felt we should have sorted 5 minutes earlier, and they found exactly the same difficulties. Change in the British system is extremely difficult. You have the same civil service, you have the same circumstances, you have the same budgets, and the question is, how can you be cleverer than your predecessors? So I don't think it's at all easy being in British government. We tried to resolve the issues in the Conservative Party by changing prime ministers. I mean, to a penny.
A few times.
And of course we learned that it wouldn't make any difference at all. The British system doesn't depend upon the Prime Minister, who is primus inter pares. It depends upon the Cabinet and the Parliament, as well as the judiciary and the King. So to think you can change it is a bit unrealistic. We had an election. The electorate said what they wanted, and our job, therefore, is to try to make the best of it, to make the best outcomes for the electorate. It's not at all easy. And I fear they've found immediately how hard it is to run the Treasury, which would seem to be the most important ministry at the moment. So I'm very sorry for them. This is really hard. And I hope for the rest of us that they make a success of it.
Of course. You have had an interesting political career because you haven't always been a Conservative. You crossed the bench. Did they say cross the bench? You crossed...
I crossed the floor in a big rage with the Conservative Party because I'd bumped into some corruption. And coming from a very old-fashioned background of conservatism, I just thought that was unacceptable. And when I pointed it out, of course, people didn't like it, and there was more corruption, and there was real corruption, and that came out a bit later on. So I gave evidence to the inquiry on that, and then people were very angry with me. But personally, I think we should work, all of us should work, to have a clean team, whichever side we're on. We should have the cleanest possible House of Commons. So I left and joined the Liberal Democrats, who very kindly allowed me to stand for the European Parliament. And of course, when I got there, I discovered the European Parliament was actually riddled with corruption.
It's really bad.
And the dear old Liberal Democrats were as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my next-door companion was found guilty later on. So
Right. Yeah.
corruption is something we've all got to fight.
Yes.
And that's why I shifted. And then quite a long time later, when I came back to the House of Lords, the Conservative Party, very kindly, Lord Taylor, then the Chief Whip, invited me to cross the floor back again. And since I was always voting with the Conservatives, as the Liberal Democrats pointed out, rather upset by this, and since I never campaigned against a Conservative candidate, I don't think I was really much good to the Liberal Democrats either. So I've accepted the kind invitation, and the Association of Conservative Peers voted in favour of asking me back again. And so I recrossed the floor and came back again.
What do you think that the Conservative Party needs to do to regroup and to find its identity again?
The Conservative Party needs to support Kemi Badenoch to the hilt. Kemi is great news. I worked with her as a trade envoy for various different countries, and I also worked with her on the transgender issue. She's absolutely first class. So to regroup is not really the word, it's back Kemi and work really hard to make her views happen.
And do you think she can take on the Reform Party?
The Reform Party, I'm rather sorry for them. Any party, any individual that follows Nigel Farage will be disappointed. Because Nigel is a one-man band. And not all politicians are like that. Kemi Badenoch is not, for example. But Nigel is really a one-man band. And that means that those he attracts to himself, because he's not that self-confident, he then pushes them away very quickly. So it won't work. He's not a gatherer. He's an individual of interest, but it won't work.
Well, lots of people might disagree with that because they have now surpassed the Conservative membership. So they have hundreds of thousands of members now, and he's a very clever campaigner. So who's to say that they could break the two-party system and be in the next government?
But you can join with no fear of any worry now, any old party you like, because there's not going to be another election. It's easy to join and say, up yours, I've had enough of the Conservative Party, you misled me, X, Y and Z. But it won't actually last. And that's Nigel's inborn weakness. He's not somebody who has the sort of glue that sticks for good. He's the sort of person who has that white glue that comes off when you've used it once. So he's not, in other words, a proper leader. He's interesting, he's fun, I like him, I've done bits of television with him, and he's good fun. But that's not the point. To have somebody steady and stable and big enough and wise enough and serious enough to negotiate globally, that's not Nigel Farage. Remember, I was in the European Parliament with him, and I'm sorry to say there's a really rather unpleasant side to him, really deeply unpleasant. Some of the filthy statements he made in Brussels. That's not a real leader. You've got to have a decent way of looking at life, of respecting others, even if they don't agree with you. For our part, I mean, they might be right in the end, but even if they're not right, their dignity matters, who they are matters, their futures matter. Otherwise, why am I in politics at all? No, Nigel can't stick. It's a nice frivol to join him now, but it means absolutely nothing in 5 years' time, or sooner, 5 weeks' time. People get very disappointed with it, I'm sorry to say. You know, that's why new little parties keep being founded.
Yeah.
And it's terribly easy to make statements about I would do this, I would do that, and I would do the other, if you have no responsibility, no power, and no capacity to alter anything. That's the weakest possible position for a politician.
I want to move on to international politics and talk about the Middle East, because you've done a lot of work there, and a lot of people are talking about the situation in Syria at the moment, and there is a new leader in Syria, Mohammed Abu al-Julani, and it seems like he's trying to make himself come across as a bit of a statesman. However, he has a very Islamist background. Do you have much faith in the future of Syria with him as the leader?
The Syrian people are rather high-quality people. They used to be extraordinarily multifaceted and very intelligent and very well-educated people. I don't know what's been happening under Assad, although I did manage to steal money from Assad's back pocket when he wasn't looking, not once but twice, to use to support the children in northern Lebanon that he had recently thrown out, who needed food and education. So I was rather pleased. I picked his back pocket illicitly, stole the money, and spent it on those children who he'd determinedly thrown out. So he was actually supporting Syrian children in North Lebanon without knowing. I was so pleased I went back for a second go. So hopefully I won't meet him. But
well, he's locked away in Russia. So.
Absolutely. I'm not convinced that the new lot are any better. I think that's slightly different. But no, I have a wait-and-see mode. I would like to get there and do some charitable work. And if I could find somebody with a pocket to spend that, I would do that. I chair a charity called the Ammar International Charitable Foundation, very, very low cost, working with the World Health Organization and with UNESCO on health and education. That's really what we should be doing in there, all of us. But I haven't yet found any funding to do it.
Do you worry about the Yazidis in Syria?
The Yazidis are a very small, antique, religious little group of people who Hardline Islam hates. I don't know why Hardline Islam should hate other faiths in the way that it does. To put it bluntly, that's non-Quranic. In the Holy Quran, it says that you should respect other people's faiths. But that's not modern hardline Islam, which is a very nasty breed of belief. And if you look at the background of the new Syrians, you see they founded Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda was the beginning of ISIS, and that nearly crashed the whole of Iraq and vast quantities in the Middle East. So I'm worried for Syria, obviously, but at the moment I can't find a way of helping. My team were working enormously hard in Iraq, north, middle, south, marsh people, Yazidis, everywhere. Tiny charity, always trying to find funding, called the Ammar Foundation, with a great body of volunteers in the States, from Utah, the Latter-day Saints supporting us as well as people here. But it's a tough area, the Middle East, and the acceptance of freedom to believe is key. Freedom to have another faith than just the very narrow way in which you interpret your own faith. It's one of the fundamental freedoms. Freedom of belief, freedom of movement, and so on, you know.
You talk about hardline Islam. Do you think it's come to Britain?
Certainly, there are elements of some of the believers here in Britain who do not accept British law. British law is based, if I could put it this way, on the second great commandment, love thy neighbour as thyself. In other words, it's beneficent law. Hardline Islam is controlling and punishing law. And we may have a crash, which is boiling up, I hope not, because those two ways of looking at things are very different. Either you look at your neighbour as your friend and you want to help them, or you look at your neighbour as your enemy and you want to control them. It's as simple as that. And here in the United Kingdom, coming from a Christian background, whether or not people go to church is fairly irrelevant. It's actually the way in which our legislation is founded on the second great commandment, love thy neighbour as thyself. And if you do that, then you look at them more kindly, and the law is bent that way. If you don't, if you look at it more like communism, except it's not state control, it would be Islamic control, but it's the same thing. It's control, 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 instead of freedom, freedom, freedom. So I think the next decade is going to be on what the fundamental freedoms are. Are we all prepared to go to the death for the fundamental freedoms? I certainly am. For other people, not just for ourselves. And I think that's going to have to be a big part of the discussion in the next decade, here, there and everywhere.
Emma, Baroness Nicholson, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.